Welcome everyone to the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research Think and Drink series of virtual talks. We hope you are all as well and healthy as any of us could possibly be given the state of the world in which we live. I'm Scott Hinkle. I am the director of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, and I am so happy that you're with us tonight. In just a second, I'm going to introduce Dr. Ken Giroux, who's a member of the Institute's steering committee, who will be our moderator this evening. But I have a few notes to share with you before we get to tonight. Tonight's talk is titled, What We've Lost, What We've Found, 3 Creative Writers on Responding to Environmental Change. First, a couple of technical notes. For anyone who is joining us, you find right down here both a Q&A button and a chat button. If you want to send a note to our panelists, you can either type into the Q&A, and if you do that, it will go just to the panelists and only the panelists will see it. But if you want to type into the chat, you may choose either to send a message to just the panelists or to all the panelists and everyone who is with us in the audience tonight. This summer, we have our Think and Drink conversations every other week. 2 weeks from tonight, we will have a book talk with Dr. Justin Farrell, who is the author of Billionaire Wilderness, The Ultra Wealthy and the Remaking of the American West. Dr. Farrell is an associate professor in the Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. If you'd like to keep in touch with us, you can send an email to humanities@uwyo.edu, and that will get you on our mailing list. In just a second, I'll type that into the chat box so you all can have it. And two more things, if I may please. Coming up on July 15th is Wyo Gives Day. Wyoming has a very robust network of cultural and arts organizations and nonprofit organizations. And this year is the launch of a day of coordinated giving to all of those organizations. If you feel you are in the place to make such a donation, the Humanities Institute has a great partner in the Wyoming Humanities Council. We do all sorts of programs together. The Wyoming Humanities Council is our state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So if you feel so moved, please, on July 15th, just go to WyoGives, WYOGIVES.org, and you can make a contribution that you see. And one last note, I'm sure many people here in Laramie have heard the news, but I want us to take a moment to remember Brad Watson, who is a professor in the creative writing program here at the University of Wyoming, who died yesterday. We will miss him very much, good friend of the Humanities Institute, and we would be hard pressed to find a kinder, nicer human being. Author of the very beautiful book, Miss Jane, among other things. So please do check it out, and we will miss you, Brad. Our moderator for tonight, as I mentioned earlier, is Dr. Ken Giroux, a member of the Humanities Institute Steering Committee, who I'll turn it over to now, who will introduce our speakers, please.
Thank you, Scott. I'll do the introductions in the order in which it's a Hollywood Squares kind of moment, and I'll just do them in the order in which you appear on my screen. It may not be the same on everybody's screen, but Janice, that means you're, well, yep, Janice, you're still first. Now Scott's gone blank. Janice Ray, her first book, which by pure chance I happen to have in front of me or with me, is Ecology of a Cracker Childhood. And it tells a tale of her growing up, and the writing is structurally written in a way where there's episodes or moments from her growing up that impelled her, inspired her, touched her, juxtaposed with more current topic of writing that has to do with the environment that she still lives in for the most part. And as a result of her growing up and the people she grew up with, her parents in particular, she grew up to be an environmentalist. And I think it's fair to say that the longleaf pine forests of the American South should be, if trees could be, would be grateful to Janice for everything she's done for them. And next in line is Anne Mccutchen. And this is a book I just happen to have in front of me called River Music that she published on the order of a decade ago. And it studies the decades-long changes in the Atchafalaya River Basin in Louisiana, from a river basin where the Atchafalaya River wound its way through the basin, and the people who lived there lived with the rhythms of the river on a seasonal cycles, fishing and hunting and so on. And of course, over the decades, more and more land was purchased by individuals, or there was government intervention to improve things like making waterways more navigable. And so life changed in ways that weren't always positive. And she, along with her, I'll say, collaborator in the book, Earl Robichaud, who captured the sounds of the Atchafalaya before they disappeared. She's documented that decades-long transition from maybe 50 years ago until close to the current moment. So I'm just illustrating each of these people, who they are, by one book in particular. And by sheer chance, again, I happen to have right in front of me a book called The Home Place. Drew Lanham wrote this, and it's just like Janice's book is a memoir of his growing up and how that impelled him to become who he is as a human being, among other things. There's some wonderful anecdotes in there that I can quite relate to, but also drew him into the environment and ecology, and initially, and still a big thread with birders, and I can relate to that a lot too. He's currently an ecologist at Clemson University. So you said earlier, Drew, that you're an unstructured person, but I know very well as an academic that we're impelled to create our own structure. Every day we wake up, okay, what scares me today? What do I have to get done? And the structure is not imposed from outside, but there's no question there's structure. So all three of these people approaching in a broad sort of way a similar topic from different perspectives, different experiences. I'll say the environment and changes in the environment. We're going to talk about that, and they came up with the title, What We've Lost, What We Found, and the focus of that lost and found is talking about responding to environmental change. I'll start by asking if any of the three of you, and there's no thou shalt here, would like to make a brief comment before I start peppering you with difficult questions.
I would. Thank you so much, Kenneth and Scott, for having me and all of us on this panel. Drew and Ann are old, dear friends and colleagues of mine, and I'm really grateful to be here. And I want to send greetings also to everybody who's listening during this time of a pandemic, and just how grateful we are to have your presence with us tonight. But thanks for having me and us.
Well, you're very welcome. I'll just jump right in then.
I'd like to add my thanks.
Go ahead.
Yeah, may I jump in? I'm jumping in.
Please.
And to go back to the title, What is Lost, What is Found, I think we might all agree, and disagree with me if you like, that as writers, what we're always trying to do is answer a question, whether it's by way of an essay or a book or a chapter, where we are compelled to find out something, answer a question. A book or an essay is usually a result of curiosity, right? Something we want to find out. And so perhaps we have that in common. We're always finding something. And perhaps in the finding, we learn what has been lost. Possibly. What do you think?
Exchanges, right? I mean, this is, we're bartering, really, and bartering our lives, I think, in some ways. Certainly, this quarantine has us, you know, in a different place, and understanding what the barter really costs. So I like to think of what I'm exchanging for my life at this point. And, I think we're at the convergence, obviously, of several different crises. There's the viral crisis, this pandemic. There's the political crisis of this current moment, the last 4 years. And then there's the sin of racism and that pandemic and how it strikes. And so, that convergence of all of that, we're with each of them, you're bartering one thing for the other. And at some point you got to go to market and figure out what you're going to come away with. And I think that's sort of a daily thing for us.
That's a good point.
So as an environmentalist looking at this and Drew in a bigger way, so I've been writing about the natural world for 25 years, and most of what I write about is grief because we've lost so much. So it was interesting to be presented with this topic because I don't normally focus on what is found or, Drew, as you say, the barter. But I want to just right here in the beginning, in doing a little bit of research about this, I found a poem by Robert Frost called Directive, where he finds this old abandoned farm in this old abandoned town. And behind the farm is a brook, and he drinks from that brook. And I've got he says, here are your waters and your watering place. Drink and become whole again beyond confusion. So that's even more than a barter that he's talking. Drink and become whole again beyond confusion, which seems impossible to me.
Biblical.
Yeah.
Is that biblical?
Seems to me.
Yeah.
Hezekiah 3:17, I think.
So we get into this psychological aspect of like losing yourself, finding yourself. And so this idea, this psychology idea of finding by losing, which is less of a barter, it seems, than this new greater place you get to. And all this is so new to me because I'm so deep in mourning. And let me just speak right here to the issue of race. What we find can never replace all that we lost, and I'm so used to focusing on that.
Well, I think really, Janice, to that point of being in sort of constant mourning, as environmentalists, as naturalists, and then trying to balance that with the beauty, which is in part that exchange that we make. I mean, we got to recognize what's left in order to understand the cost of what we lost. And I go back and I think about the importance of your book to me. Was this understanding of culture and conservation, that there was this interplay, that you gave up a certain thing to be who you are, but in being who you are, you gain certain things. And that's one of the things I think I'm finding, or maybe I'm looking for it, is sort of this identity on a daily basis, and who I am in all of this, and whatever plague there is. And speaking of biblical, I keep thinking about my grandmother's plagues, that she would have me read out of the Bible, and she'd shake her head now and say, "Baby, it's come to pass." So, the balancing the mourning and the sadness and that loss with what we can still find that's beautiful enough to inspire us is sort of my daily thing. And I'll be honest about it, for a while, especially once the protests hit the streets and it just seemed like things were going on and on and on, it was hard to find beauty, even as I looked straight at it.
And would you say that maybe it's through his recordings, but what would you say in terms of lost and found that you found or gained, or the world found or gained perhaps through your journey in Louisiana?
Well, I was basically following a friend, Earl Robichaux, who's a musician and an Acadian, 100% Cajun blood, through the Atchafalaya Basin for about 4 years, various trips, as he, with his field recorder, took recordings of birds, of wind and weather, oral histories of people, Cajun families who'd been there for years, Native American, Chitimaca folks. He was, with sound, he was trying to get as much of the old world as he could. He considered the Atchafalaya Basin his habitat, and of course it was. He grew up there, as did his forebears. So he was trying to capture as much as he could before it all went. And I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the sea level rise, and in coastal Louisiana, that's where we were. So one of the many lessons I learned in following him around and speaking with him and speaking to the old people who lived there was that they were holding on as much as they could to the old ways, the old traditions. And some of them had been, the old ways had been taken into commercial use, like crawfish festivals and the like, and tourist attractions. But on the other hand, there were some very good museums coming up that gave people, visitors and local people, their history, which was something found. For many of them did not know a full history of that place and of their people. So that was something through his work and the work of others, this history and culture was brought to light. That's a way of finding something, perhaps resurrecting or bringing to the fore something that's important. So not sure I answered your question, but there's something.
Well, yeah, it doesn't actually, back to you, Janice, it doesn't actually replace what's been lost.
No.
But it's still something that came out of the moment that that we found, and Drew described it as bartering, which we usually think of as an intellectual exercise, a conscious exercise, but there's also soul or psychological bartering, where we find something that is worthwhile holding on to that we didn't.
I think we have. Sorry, I hope I didn't interrupt him. I think we have to. I mean, I think that it is in the found part of the equation that hope exists. And, we are always a future seeking species. And I think that is actually one of the things that's so difficult about the pandemic is we can't see the future. And so it's very hard to really hold dear this thing, this hope, this thing of hope. So, yeah.
And I wonder, it's a question for Janice and Drew. I think I came in a little bit late to the green room, but I've just finished a book, and friends remind me that I always have a few months of anxiety because I don't know what I'm going to write next. But I honestly am anxious because I don't know what my place is. I don't know who needs to hear from me about anything. And that's part of the pandemic situation. I feel, on the one hand, a lot of access to other people, and here we are. On the other hand, I feel very much alone and not sure where I fit in any conversation. Now I'm here, I'm glad. But I wonder if you feel that way. What's to investigate next or reflect on next?
Well, it's a morbidly target-rich environment. I mean, there's so much out there, and I think, as well, if we're going to call ourselves nature writers, which I think we all do, whether we're writing about wildness or the nature of our fellow human beings, this pandemic is a nature story, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
It's all about a transgression, a great transgression. So for me, that is part of the finding, that ultimately, that's our story. And what we have been seeking in this future that we're constantly seeking, as Janice talks about, as Americans strictly, maybe as Western societies, sort of this, but Americans, let me drop back to that. This exceptionalism, that nature does not impact us the same as it does everyone else, strikes me, and so that we can have nature on our own terms, as long as we gate it or call it a national park or somehow control it, and we're being proven wrong at a very high cost on a daily basis. So that to me, every story now, as we talk about exponential curves and flattening curves and all of those things, every story has to come back to how we dealt with nature. Because everything is going through that filter. The other plagues are going through that filter now,
Right?
Because it's going to have the final say.
And the bottom line is connectivity. We're all connected, from the single cell organism to a rocket scientist. We are connected. That the pandemic does underscore that, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And it also underscores our absolute willingness to listen to these dominant paradigms that have destroyed the environment for so long. And the one that strikes me the most is travel. It's like, so we're, I have been just gobsmacked by the skies, looking out just day after day after day, and there are no contrails in the skies. And we have these skies back that I remember as a kid. So, I have the thought that comes to me is that we are willing to do for a pandemic what we have not been willing to do for the future of humanity, for, the future of the atmosphere. And that's been just that thought, if you let that thought sit in you a while, that it just takes a while to deconstruct that and parse it out, that for the pandemic, we have been willing to do what we have previously been unwilling to do.
I recall a couple of months ago driving from Wyoming to Colorado, going south. And normally when you're going south on I-25, you see this ring or cloud of industrial stuff over Denver. There's a terrible pollution problem there. But the pandemic had hit, everybody was staying home, and suddenly Denver had no pollution. It was, and I lived down that way for a time, and in the mornings I did not hear the interstate because no one was going to work. So the sound had changed, there was a lack of sound, and the air was clean. I'm sure others adjacent to cities saw that as well. Yeah, and then it struck me, well, okay, how could we keep it this way? Public transportation, for one thing, less noise, less pollution. The answers have been there for a long time, but here was something I could look at and say, this is how it could be.
But you know what, Anne and Janice, what are we willing to pay for that? Or when I say we, I mean, again, here's a cost that that many Americans are proving they're unwilling to pay.
Yeah.
So, our cost for the price on wildness, on clean skies, clean air, clean water, clean soil, wildlife. I heard a report the other day just how many fewer animals are being killed on roads because of the decrease in traffic. So there have been things that we have found that are good in this.
Oh yeah.
But and we have said that we wanted them, but we never really asked at what cost. And so there are some of us who say, well, you know what? I don't want to go back to the old normal. We can't go back to that old normal and the way things were in many different aspects. But then there are others that say, well, there's no way the American way of life will be lost, because we can no longer pollute as we did. We can no longer carelessly travel as we did. We can no longer do all these things. So I think one of the things that I'm finding too is that there, as if we needed it, but there's this new sort of chasm between what some people are willing to pay and others aren't willing to pay.
Yes.
And I'm going to be interested to see how that plays out. You know, whether we are going to try to, people are going to try to sort of boomerang us back to where we were, into that normal, or we agree and say, you know what, okay, it's better this way. Let's see how we can quiet things.
Mhm. So to take it a step, just to take that idea, Drew, a step further, and that is, so what we've lost, of course, is travel and our ability to move about at will, for pleasure often. But what we've gained is really contemplation. And as you say, we've needed a come to Jesus or come to Buddha moment for a long, long time. And the pandemic has given us that. So I think individually, so, you know, we always thought that we Americans have equated movement with importance. You know, like if you're shooting the podcast of yourself from the car that's taking you from the hotel to the airport, you know, it's like that makes you more important. So being stuck, people in poverty are stuck. Being stuck is insignificant. Is insignificance. But what we're finding is that being stuck actually gives us this opportunity to examine ourselves and our lives. And I think what's coming out of the pandemic individually is also so cool. You know, like some people are getting divorces, some people are getting married, some people, and it, you know, it's as a society, it's going to be very interesting. And I think as somebody in the chat said, it's going to be, I mean, capitalism is going to want us to get back where we were.
Yeah.
So hopefully what we're going to find is more individual choices that, you know, that redefine the word stuck.
I sure hope you're right,
Yeah.
Janice. I mean, I can see that for myself, but I wonder how many people, and they may not be listening, I don't know, just can't wait for things to get back to the way they were. And we know there are enough demonstrations and you know, a few op-eds out there about getting back to the old ways. What's going to happen then if there are those of us who enjoy the quiet, the contemplation, the revisiting of who we are and our role in the world and how things can be different, and then those who are just, you know,
Well,
screw you, you know.
well, you know, and we've been quiet enough to hear those who haven't been heard before.
Yes, true.
And so that quiet, that contemplation and sort of this intensification of noticing, I think, you know, I'm normally one of those people who's traveling a lot in May with the birds and speaking and leading these bird tours, but everything this spring was in the yard. And so I had to be sort of this net cast to catch the birds that were coming through my yard from South America, Central America, all these places that birds are drifting from in migration. And I don't call myself a birder any longer, really. I call myself a bird watcher. And that's how I started, because to watch individual birds, of whether it's the cardinal that's always in your backyard or the rose-breasted grosbeak that showed up, it was this very different sort of stillness for me. But then that was stacked on top of, so being at home and getting sort of into that rhythm of stillness. And suddenly you have the other unrest and the protest and things happening. And so I was trying to parse them apart in my brain, and I couldn't, and they all sort of came together. And so as a writer, then everything that I've been writing about has been about those collisions.
Yes.
That's
So
cool.
I found that.
So Drew, that's cool because there's so many great metaphors in that, you know, like the unrest is viral, you know,
Yeah,
as was the oppression.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
beautiful.
Well, I mean, again, it's, daily you just sort of sit, and I've been keeping a file of Corona writings, and a lot of it is social media posts, but it's interesting to follow it. And then on Facebook, you'll get the reminders from the previous year of what was going on,
Right.
you know? And that to me, again, is another sort of measure of gain and lost or barter, in that, I mean, who could have predicted this? As Janice said, we're constantly seeking the future, and here we are. And I always wonder, we're constantly seeking the future, not being in the present, but what are we going to do when we find the future? Well, here we are, and we're not handling it well. Personally, I think many of us are, but societally, we aren't handling it well.
I wanted to jump in about the travel, the mobility. Normally, a time or two a year. I know you two travel a lot as well, but I also write lyrics for musical pieces, and I was to have an opera premiere in New York the first week of June. Nope.
Oh.
No.
Ouch.
It didn't happen. It's a small company, not the Metropolitan Opera, but still a good company. And we've been working up to this for some years, and now it's definitely on hold. It's not clear whether the company will even survive the pandemic. And what I found interesting was first the grief over the tabling of this project after so many years of work, but also relief that I didn't have to get on a plane and do that thing. And I was perfectly happy to sit here. So, I mean, two things. I mean, I would love the work to be heard. At the same time, I was okay with just sitting home. So, yeah, I don't want to go to New York right now.
Here's a thought that ties together things all three of you have been saying, that Janice made the point that one consequence immediately, at least right now for the pandemic, is because of the pandemic, is that the American way of life is somehow lost or at least stalled. And as you all have noted, that some people are keen to get back to it and others not so much. But the American way of life had, I think it's fair to say, an abundant disregard for nature in a certain way, individuals notwithstanding. The American way of life is also very clearly racist, and that's being brought to a boil. We're at a cultural crisis, both for all the things we were just talking about now: travel, our usual ways of doing business, literally business, and how we treat each other, how we treat the world around us. There were some of the aspects of that way of life. Some of them were positive in different ways, increased lifespan for most people and so on. But there were prices that were either unacknowledged or not even seen. That's all on hold now. What might we find? What might we find in the future? What might our new present moment look like if we were to fantasize what it might look like?
So Kenneth, if you're speaking, strictly in terms of ecology, then it's, that would look like what a lot of people have been working toward for a long time, which is restoration. It's like, who wants to go back to where we were? We want to go back to, some point much farther back in ecological, geological history, I'll say. So that's my answer, restoration.
I think it looks more fully involved with other people who haven't been involved.
Mhm.
You know, we I think it became obvious to some people after the event in Central Park that there were Black people bird watching, and so but we are out there, and we're out there not just bird watching but hiking, and there are brown people and red people and yellow people and all sorts of people doing all sorts of things in nature, but in very different ways, and many people sustaining themselves in nature, hand to mouth kinds of sustenance. So I think that's one of the things that we are going to find is that we are finding nature in our own way. And this opens a lot of people's eyes. Hopefully it will open a lot of eyes to that there are others out there, different others in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, so Drew, to tag on that a little bit, you know, as a feminist, I think I'll respond as a feminist, sort of hesitatingly, but the stories of nature writing that women have told, as opposed to men, have been very different. You know, many male narratives are the hero's journey of going far away to the Arctic, and a lot of women's tales have been more, you know, cyclical in nature, the heroine's journey being more put and noticing the cycles. And so I'm just wondering if maybe more of us will be telling the heroine's journey, you know, the journey from our own place.
You know, Janice, can I respond to that?
Yeah.
You know what, I think I've been thinking hard about this because so most of my mentors have been women.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you and Rachel Carson and one of my great advisors, Dr. Patty Gawadi, who's at the University of Georgia and preeminent ecofeminist. So and a lot of that research was sort of this cyclical and understanding the cycles and standing and watching sorts of things. And so that intensification of the pandemic and us noticing and not having to rush to see things or tell the stories of far off places,
Mm-hmm.
I think has been, you know, for me, that's another sort of found thing. But I made the decision before the pandemic certainly began to speed it up, but that I got off of every national conservation board that I was on because I wanted to be able to pay attention to home being the region, the South especially.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to be here for migration. You know, I wanted to see the birds that were coming through, you know, the Southern Appalachians. I wanted to be able to sit on my deer stand in the fall here. So a lot of what I think the stories of, how should I put this? Everybody except the majority male really have been different in some ways. But because the stories that are always told and who we're compared to are often white male writers. You know, Aldo Leopold is one of my writing heroes. But I look at his stories and that story of telling the cycles of home. I mean, that hits to me. That's why ecology hit to me. And that's why, you know, everything to me always comes, I try to leverage everything back home to tell stories of my home.
You know, my model for the Chafalaya book was John McPhee. So I'm a woman taking John McPhee as a you know, sort of a god. I mean, one of his deals with so many of his books was to follow an expert around. and write about that expert, personally, who that person was, and then through that expert, explore a certain part of the world. And I love his work so much, and that was the model I took for going around a river basin with Earl Robichaux. But the sex is, I'm the woman with the rubber boots and having the adventure, following the adventurer, and and I loved it. I really, really loved it, even though some park rangers told me not to go into a certain place because 3 women were raped there last week, and I might not feel comfortable, especially after they told me that. I didn't. But in the process of following Earl around and doing that adventure, my own personal story of where I grew up, of home in Florida, kept popping into the narrative. It's there. It's in the book. Once in a while I reference that Florida town or that beach, and when I got done with the book, I thought, what was happening? Like another book wanted to be written, and it kept popping in, and that so I did follow that with a memoir of the place I grew up in and the environment and so forth. So it was as if I had to take that model, take that journey, reverse the sex, or be the woman instead of the man following wherever on an adventure to get to my own story, which was a great pleasure to have that come about. I resist writing about myself sometimes, and boy, I didn't resist with that book. So.
It's so great to hear both of you speak about this. Like, Drew, you're exactly right. You wrote about home place, you wrote the woman's story, really. And Anne, oddly enough, I mean, to hear that you were shadowing McPhee with that. I mean, I've had a lot of antipathy toward McPhee. I just remember in a Forager, he followed Yule Gibbons. He invited Yule Gibbons down this river, the Susquehanna. Remember that? He's like 7 days out eating wild food with Yule Gibbons. And I've always been so mad about that because I just think, as a woman, how in the world could I ever invite this single man out in the woods for 7 days? So I'm glad you did it.
Yeah, I did it. Yeah, it was fun.
Well, and part of the strength of that journey that you took with river music, Anne, was in fact stopping and noticing, and you're focusing on the cycles, the patterns.
Yes.
So I mean, the way you described it sounded a little different, but that whole book still has to do, just like Drew's writing and Janice's, has to do with noticing and being present. So I think all 3 of you have that, bring that to your writing, whether it's deeply personal moments that stuck with you. Drew, you told the story about the BB gun and your first experience actually hunting with a BB gun. Could have been word for word, right? And I can still remember it 50 years later and going, oh man, I do not feel good about what I just did.
Yeah.
Right? A typical moment of a kid growing up. It's got to do with the environment. You think you're doing, quote unquote, the guy thing, or I suppose as 10-year-olds, we might not have used the phrase the manly thing, going out hunting with our BB gun, and man, it's not all as clean and clear as you like it to be.
Yeah.
It's Ken, it's reminding the data that we know best. And as a scientist, I don't care how many repeated measures you take. I don't care how many times you census a spot. I don't care how careful you are. There's no data like yourself. And that's one of the found things I think that both Anne and Janice have spoken to, and certainly many of those out there who are chiming in on the chat, is that this situation has caused us to dig more deeply into who we are, and so that data set that we thought we knew, we're re-examining it, and we're reanalyzing it, and we like some of what is coming out in the analysis. Some of it's going to require further work, right? But that's this sort of thing, and I think one of the things that we're losing that's good, I like to call this the second lost cause. and that first lost cause that persisted for so long, that's being torn down. The lost cause that we are in the process, hopefully, of not reconstructing in some sort of way is the one of rampant hypercapitalism, and that really has built these worlds of haves and have-nots that are creating a lot of the angst that we're seeing in other ways. So
yeah, Drew, it's that's led to devaluation of entire groups and races and nationalities of people, and also devaluation of culture. Yeah.
And nature.
Earlier, when I was speaking of not knowing what to write, being between projects, and I'm sure you know what that is like. Or maybe you always have the next thing. Anyway, I don't. A couple of things. One is that for me, the thing always comes to me, whatever it is. If I seek that book, it's not there. The subject comes, or whatever. And the other thing is that I think I've always been motivated, with very few exceptions, as a writer, to be of service in some way, to put something out there that serves readers, serves others, serves a cause, if you will, so that it is just not me, which was, I had a problem with the memoir, but I got over that because I believe it was a service. But that, so when I talk about what to do next, I'm asking myself, how can I best use my abilities now? How would I best serve?
So are we protesting in any way? Is our writing, are we crafting protest in any way?
Good question.
Well, Drew,
I mean,
changing from data analysis and getting rid of repeated measures analyses and nonlinear hierarchy and Bayesian analyses in favor of personal journey, you're talking to a statistician, and I couldn't agree more. Totally with you on the importance of losing that to some degree and finding something else. So cheers.
Cheers.
And,
Yeah.
and you've mentioned this twice, and so this must be really weighing on you, this idea of what to do next. I've been in that position sometimes. When I'm teaching classes, I'll have my my major professor was Bill Kittredge out in Montana.
Yeah.
And he said, it's about obsessions. I'll remember his quote in a minute, but writing well is a matter of figuring out what obsesses you.
Absolutely.
You may want to play around with that a little, just in your journal. Just start making lists. I mean, Buhner, the man you and I have been talking about, Buhner talks about this, making lists of what you love.
I just made that list, Janice.
I
just made that list because I'm rereading the book because you had read it. Yeah.
Well, there may be something on that list then that is begging for your story and its story to be told. I believe that. The other is laying down on the ground with your head to the north and saying, I am at your service, earth, do with me what you will. And maybe a lot of praying will bring it.
I've been doing that, and I expect an answer.
I have a good friend we have a good friend, John Lane, who he took some of my writing and we exchange, and he went through a piece of the writing and did a word search, right? For a certain word, and my obsessions were obvious. And just in sort of in ways that I had not picked up. And so having other eyes on your work that we know is important, but then it tells me that when I crafted an essay a while back that's similar to, and it was inspired really by Terry Tempest Williams' Why I Write essay, And I think all writers need to do that. It's sort of a mission statement, but I revisit that, and most of what I write flows back through a certain funnel or filter. And as much as, I don't know, I try to get out of it, you know, and I don't feel stuck in it. I feel like it's what I'm supposed to do. It feels like mission work, sort of. So, you know, laying my head to the north and do with me as you will. At this point, I feel like any writing has and to serve that mission, which I think ultimately, I hope is serving some other people in some kind of way, you know, some touch point somewhere.
Thank you. Yeah. The book I just finished took 6 years, and I think I'm partly exhausted. But
I understand.
yeah.
We all need to recharge once in a while.
Did you hear that?
Yes.
Was that Siri? Ask Siri what she lost or gained.
What should I write about next, Siri?
You guys didn't help me at all. Here's the answer right here.
We're only allowed 3 panelists in one discussion, so Siri has to take it back. That was funny.
Oh my gosh.
That's perfect.
Okay. Wow.
Well,
A question that came from the audience, with the changes that have hit all of us, all of you, with the pandemic, and has your sense of time changed? And how do you think that is or might affect your writing?
One of you want to go? My sense of time has changed dramatically, and I would suspect that everybody's has, just from the lack of a schedule. And it doesn't really matter when I get up and when I go to bed. Things seem much more amorphous now. The thing that has affected my writing more is not that sense of timelessness. It's not knowing what's going to happen, and also, you know, just because we're being really honest on this panel, I'm a nature writer who's aging. I'm 58, and so there's this other way that my work is changing, where I'm trying to find what my voice is in the world as an older nature writer. And where, you know, the things that I took for granted as a younger writer aren't, and as a time when the publishing world was different, aren't things that I can take for granted now. And so that really is the bigger sort of time warp I'm in, which is, how do I respond to the new realities of the publishing world? And those realities, once we come out of this pandemic, when we do, are going to be even more changed.
I'm with you. I'm older, and there's a part of me that is now saying, okay, with the time I have left, and maybe I have 30 years, and maybe I have 3, what is most important for me to do? So there's a certain pressure that I put on myself, I suppose, to you know, to do right, do the right thing. It's simple. Day to day, I'm used to working alone or with one person close by, and so that hasn't changed. But still, the lack of a schedule, like this day I must drive 7 miles to Whole Foods or whatever it is. I mean, that's all gone. It's all gone. It's those sorts of tasks are sort of fallen away. Whenever they get done, they get done. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Same, guys. I think for me, it's been, you know, there's some days that seem sort of infinitely long, and you know, I wonder, as the days get shorter and we sort of drift into this darkness and we don't have the same choices of being out and escaping, even into our backyards, what it's going to be like. But I think I've paid closer attention maybe to my own rhythms, some of the internal rhythms that had been taken over by, flight schedules and faculty meetings. So it's not been an easy transition. I think it's almost like being on, all of that was maybe the sugar that kept me going. And now on this sort of sugar-free diet, I'm having to understand my own rhythm.
Yes.
And my own sort of time schedule. So, I still get up with the first wren or cardinal in the morning. I go to bed earlier at night. Publishers, they still want things on time. But I think everyone is a little more understanding of the amorphous nature.
I think you're right. I agree. So I wonder when it will stop being so amorphous. Are we going to be, gradually, well, we can't say, right? But will we willingly go back to a more structured existence? Do we have to? When we get a vaccine or something? Or will we take with us into the next life some of the things we found about ourselves?
Make a claim.
One will.
It's speculation, but I think before the industrial age hit us, so if we back up to the 1700s and beyond, life was more cyclical. Our daily patterns were not as tied to the clock, so to speak, in schedules. So we have, in fact, for a large part of our existence on this planet, our cycles were driven by how much light and dark there was every day, what the temperatures were like. And then the industrial age changed all that. We lost something, perhaps we gained something. And maybe now we've got the chance to lose some of that and gain some of what we have had for what in fact was the vast majority of our history as a species. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I wanted to say the closest I've come to this kind of situation we're in was the first time I went to an artist colony. And I had a month, and perhaps Janice and Drew, you've had this experience too, where all you had to do maybe was show up to dinner, maybe, and you didn't really have to show up to dinner, but you had the whole day to yourself and the whole evening. And I found that with a month of that, I found my cycles, I found what worked for me, and it was different. For a week or so, I'd go to bed at 11 o'clock like I used to do. And then it started rolling into something at later nights, later mornings. And finally, I was going to bed at 8 and getting up at 5. And something like that seemed to be the most natural. But it took a month of that, that freedom, if you will, freedom of time, to discover what was best for me. What do you say? Anyone else?
Yeah, you know what, that that experience of it's almost this loss of pretense, and so I've discovered a much smaller wardrobe, and not in a state of mind of having any wondering about what people will think about me if I show up at the meeting in shorts. so that cycle and being comfortable and just being comfortable in your skin where you are,
right?
It's and so, Anne, just as it took a while to get to this point of going to bed at 8 and getting up at 5, for so long we've been told how we should be, that how we are was foreign. And so now we're understanding maybe who we are in ways. And I no, I'm not going to travel as much. Like the opera, I'm sorry that you missed that.
Mhm.
But I will tell you that in some ways, the pandemic probably saved my life, because I had gone back into this horrendous travel schedule.
Hmm.
And when things started to fall away,
Mhm.
I realized, I said, wait a minute, was I really going to be in those many places in that short a period of time?
Mhm.
Yeah. Crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Drew and Ann, recently I heard a quote by an herbalist named Jesse Wolf Harden, and he said, isn't this beautiful? He said, I too, like the land, have lost parts of myself. Isn't that beautiful?
It's
I
beautiful.
too, like the land, have lost parts of myself.
Who is that, Janice?
His name is Jesse Wolf Harden, an herbalist.
Mm.
And so I think that's what you're both saying in some ways, that we recognize that we, like the land, had lost parts of ourselves, and the pandemic has given us that a chance to almost become wild again, this sort of rewilding of ourselves.
Mhm.
The thing that our mothers didn't want to have happen, they wanted us to get the college degree, become a lawyer, and have a savings account, but
Yeah.
I think it's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good thing.
Yeah, I think, well, that's one of the things I think that'll change, and it's changing. That whole definition of wild, which was really, well, let's be honest, it's sort of a patriarchal white concept of what wildness is,
Mhm.
and that, it's those things. For me, it's those things beyond my control, right?
Mhm.
And so that rewilding that you find a few steps from your back door is a critical thing. And I hope that it leads again to this sort of increased awareness for folks. We know that there are more people that were noticing birds, at least early on in the pandemic. Stores could not keep bird seed.
Yes.
People were ordering it like crazy.
Mhm.
So, just that appreciation. I mean, at the base of appreciation is foods and where your food comes from.
Yes. Yes. Remember how many people started making bread all of a sudden?
Oh, oh God, the sourdough tidal wave.
I know.
You know?
But there's a beauty to it as well.
It is. It is. It is.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not going to turn it down.
So an audience member just asked about anxiety. That is, it's probably a precondition, or it's a necessary element in any kind of a change moment, right? Change, whether it's positive or negative, there's a bit of anxiousness associated with it. But an audience member just typed a question. I'll let you three take a quick look at it. Acknowledging the fact that there's anxiety associated with this moment. How do you grief? You spoke to that, Janice, already, but how do you deal with anxiety over what you're losing and gaining when writing, particularly about difficult subjects?
Yeah. Wow. If anybody else can take that, do. So
Anxiety. Sorry, go ahead.
and I've noticed this in myself, and I've never been an anxious person at all. I hate to confess everything, but recently, well, first of all, I started with nervine teas. A friend of mine had advertised that she would mix teas for people, and so she sent me this mix, which has rose petals and lavender and chamomile and other things in it. It's a wonderful tea. And when I began to drink it, I realized the plants were giving me, like, something happened. Like, I went to sleep, and I'm still drinking that tea, and it is helping. But I also, about 2 weeks ago, ordered CBD oil for the first time, and that's also helping. So I'm acknowledging anxiety. I mean, we all had anxiety about the climate, about, oh my God, everything. but it has ramped up, hasn't it?
I guess.
Yeah.
Was the question about anxiety tied to writing? That's the way I understood it.
Oh,
Oh, yeah,
maybe.
so we were talking in general terms about things being lost and things being found, grief over things that are lost, and perhaps joy over new things found. But in the midst of this transition and the pandemic and the protests right now where Black Lives Matter and so on, these things that are being brought to a head, so to speak,
Yeah.
increase anxiety. And the question was along the lines of how do you process that and into your daily flow, I'll say, as writers.
Mm.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Anne, I've interrupted you again.
Go ahead. Then I'll interrupt you.
And then it'll be quick.
No,
I've done a lot of work on the consciousness, I believe. And this pandemic has allowed me to process a lot of ideas, like between effort and effortlessness is one of them. You know, like how much effort do you put out and how much do you expect things to be effortless? So this idea of anxiety, I do feel like I've been working out consciously and subconsciously. I could talk a lot more about this, but I'm going to hush in and let you go. And then, and Drew, I'd love to hear what you say.
I was taking the question a little differently, in a different direction. I don't think I'm overly anxious. I'm pretty level. Maybe I'm dead. I don't know. But I do invite anxiety. When there's something to write, to be written, that I know I'm to do it, I want to do it, then anxiety surfaces, but it's a good kind. It's like, you see that great big wave coming at you at the beach, and you know you want to dive into that wave and you're going to get the ride of your life. And so I'm for it. So I know I'm going to feel, jittery, and I'm going to have be writing all kinds of crap on slips of paper and assembling 40 books that I don't need. But it's all, it's all the process of it's a certain anxiety that prepares me to dive into that wave. So that's where I'm coming from with the anxiety thing. The day-to-day anxiety from everything that we're experiencing right now. I read in the newspapers. I'm just as conscious of it, but I'm also conscious that it is changing and it will change, and there's nothing I can do to stop certain things. But it is my job to pay attention, and to act as I can. So there, Drew, you can have it now.
Well, for me, it is, again, sort of this compounded interest, and not in a fiduciary sense. It's a compounded interest in what's going on and noticing in birds and watching them with this different intensity. It's a compounded interest in building things. Part of the way that I work out my angst is to put things together. Sometimes I've over-engineered all sorts of things because it's important for me to see something come together in some sort of way. Maybe it's my personal fight against what I consider sort of an entropic time. But then to face, as you say, Anne, to dive into that wave. When I teach writing, I always teach about writing to tension and having people understand what the tension is in the story or in the sentence, and so I write to tension, and I want that to be clear to people, that I am worried about this, or that I am fearful of this, of this thing, or that maybe I'm happily angst-ridden about what's going to happen with this bird next. So, all of those things for me, I have ways that I've tried to deal with the day-to-day routine of angst, because it is sort of this day-to-day that can wear, and it can be exhausting. I've found myself on some days when I've gotten caught up, just totally exhausted, as if I had been building. And then that next day I have to go out and physically exhaust myself.
Yep.
And part of that is just being a farm boy. Part of that is who I am, and that rhythm, and that I have to have my hands on something. My grandmother used to say, you know, idle hands are the devil's workshop, so to speak. So I try to have my hands on something, doing something, and that helps to relieve. But I dived into that wave, Ann. I write to that angst.
It is a measure of its importance. You know, I think that anxiety, angst, whatever, is a measure of its importance, not to just you, but you know it's important to others.
Yeah.
And I think I love it. I know that I'm onto something when I feel that way, and I welcome it. It's okay. It's all right.
I don't think though that we can deny the angst of the moment, you know.
Yeah.
And today, the report came out yesterday that our intensive care beds in Georgia are 82% full. Yesterday, a 14-year-old boy in Georgia died of COVID. I mean, this is an anxiety that I keep returning to, the anxiety of the moment instead of the anxiety of the page, because I'm able still to lose myself in the work. But the minute I'm up again, I want to hear the latest news on what's happening. I think we are in really, really anxious times.
I agree.
You know,
Yeah, I look. I'm like you. I lift up my head and I look at the news, and I pay attention especially to places I've lived for long periods, Texas and Florida, which are just, you know, hot spots, and that I fear for my friends. I fear for example, those who teach, who will go back into the classroom in the fall or not, who will, you know, engage with students one-on-one. No, I fear for them all.
You know, some of the, you know, I think about, as a Black man, you know, that plague that has been ongoing for 401 years is, I mean, that's sort of, unfortunately, it's the angst that we live with. And so that was part of what I was talking about when I said I write to that. And I'll be honest, for a long time, well, at least in the beginning of my career, I sort of tried to step away from that for some reason. I think I wanted, I don't know. But now it's an angst that I write to. I would not ever change who I am. I want to change how I am treated and how I am perceived. And to be able to breathe. And so in that sense, that angst, you know, that sort of constant exhaustive angst of not only seeing the number of critical care beds that are taken up, or that the virus spreads in a different way, or that somebody has tweeted some inane thing, but that somebody else was found hanging in a tree, or lynched in the street with a knee on their neck. So it's and the only way that I have to deal with that, the only way that I have to deal with it isn't in the street, because it isn't in the streets. The only way that I feel I can deal with it is to put it out there for others to see.
Yes.
You know, and that's where the craft comes in to it.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you so much for saying that. And I realize I only spoke to COVID, but there's so much anxiety. My anxiety now is not really about the unrest, you know, the civil unrest. My anxiety was, you know, when we went through, when officers and non-officers just kept going, getting away scot-free with these heinous crimes toward people of color, Black and brown people. I was much more anxious then. Just how in the world can we let this keep going on? So in some ways, you know, the past 4 months have been really a relief, and just like, oh my God, we're getting somewhere.
Mm.
Well, angst can be an alarm, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that this is a needed wake up alarm. And I think from the sense of angst being some sort of pain or discomfort, that it's a necessary pain or discomfort.
Mhm.
You know,
when you're
Just like the
anxious,
anxiety.
when you're caught by anxiety, time stops and it seems like everything takes forever. I promised you 3 at the outset that we would be done in an hour and 45, and we're racing past that. So the corollary, or I guess the antonym to that, is that when you're having, time flies when you're having a good time.
Yes.
This has been a most wonderful hour and a quarter sharing this conversation, listening to the 3 of you. I'll stop for a moment and see if any of the 3 of you have any parting comments, but this is called a think and drink, and my glass is empty, so we're done thinking, so that's it. So a parting comment or 2, and then Scott will come on and shut off the recording.
I'm just grateful for this conversation, and Janice and Drew, you know, all praise to Zoom and to Wire for putting this, making it possible for this, because I can speak to you from many, many miles and have this terrific talk. I really, really am grateful. Thank you.
I too just grateful to Ken and Scott and you, Ann, and Janice, for this opportunity really to expand. And so finding this conversation has been a highlight. So thank you all for this. And thank you all for attending and chiming in as participants. Thank you.
Great chats on the right. Wonderful.
Mhm. I'm going to echo all of your gratitude. My gratitude. You guys are old dear friends of mine, and it'd be really wonderful to continue this conversation for a long time. So it's just nice to see your faces, and I wish I could see you in person and give you both big hugs. I also am grateful for the subject, what is lost, what is found. It really drew some deep contemplation in me that, you know, that maybe there are things to be found, you know, maybe the well of grief doesn't have to be so deep, and yeah, and maybe what we find, the best parts of what we find may be parts of ourselves that we lost, you know, maybe a heart-based cognition rather than a mind-based cognition.
Well, I'll close the formal part of this by then wrapping up with something all 3 of you mentioned, which is our gratitude, I guess we can say, to the participants. So to all of you Lair amigos and all of you out there amigos, thank you for joining us this evening. Scott will now stop the recording and we'll remove ourselves to the green room.